topic of this lecture is the Bhagavad Gita, which is the definitive, most concise statement of Brahmanic ethics. The Bhagavad Gita is actually a part of a long epic poem called the Mahabharata, which is one of a number of texts that are called the Smriti. Smriti means recollected, and the texts that are included include the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and several other texts. They're authoritative, but they aren't as authoritative as the Vedas. They're considered secondary. Nevertheless, the Bhagavad Gita is extremely influential. And the section that it involves is a part of a story, really the main story of the Mahabharata, which is about a war between two rival families. Actually, they're families of cousins to make the story more complicated. But the rival families are concerned about succession to a throne. And the focus in the Bhagavad Gita is on Arjuna, who is the third brother of one of the families, the Pandavas. And he is actually the head of the army and is supposed to give the command for battle to begin. And as he stands there about to begin the battle, he looks out over the field and sees all his cousins, the Kauravas, the other family, sees people that he's known all of his life on both sides, and considers not giving the command for battle. He doesn't see anything good coming from it. It seems really unfortunate that he's in this position at all. However, he is in this position since there is this dispute over the throne, and he feels duty-bound to avenge his family and to reacquire the throne, which he believes was wrongfully taken. He's at this point talking to his charioteer named Krishna. Now, Krishna has multiple roles at this point in the story. Krishna is, besides being the charioteer for Arjuna, also the ruler of a neighboring land. But Krishna, more importantly, is an avatar being a god born in human form. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, avatars were thought to be people who are basically embodiments of God, and God comes on this earth in that form because human beings need salvation of some sort. They're facing a problem that really requires intervention. And Krishna at this point does intervene. Specifically in the Bhagavad Gita, what he does is intervene in Arjuna's doubts at this point and talks to him about what his rightful role is. The Bhagavad Gita, before I go into what Krishna has to say, combines certain ideas that we've already seen, both in Vedic thought and in Sankhya thought. Sankhya thought, just to review, focuses on the idea that consciousness is one thing and matter or nature is something else. And although we have some sense of the two being connected in our personalities, nevertheless, freedom emerges when we discover that actually consciousness need not be affected by the material world, that in fact it really isn't connected to it at all. We simply have this illusion. So the goal is to purge consciousness of a false belief. And that's the aim of the Bhagavad Gita as well. Krishna suggests that what we need to do is purify our consciousness, and all will be right. On the other hand, what Sankhya does in the course of this is, in a sense, negate everyday experience. If the focus is to free consciousness from all the things that seem to impinge on us, what one comes away with is the idea that, well, really all this is something like pollution or contamination. And the Vedas are much more affirmative about the world as a whole, since after all the world is a manifestation of Brahman. So it can't be all contamination. It's a kind of mask that Brahman has taken on. This theme too becomes important in the Bhagavad Gita. The 18 chapters of the Mahabharata that are the Bhagavad Gita are mostly the words of Krishna to Arjuna, although there's a certain dialogue between the two. And therefore, Bhagavad Gita means the song of the Blessed Lord. So what does Krishna say to Arjuna? Well, Krishna, at this point, when he sees that Arjuna is hesitating, proclaims what's called the way of karma yoga. We've talked about yoga a little bit in connection with Sankhya. Yoga is a discipline that enables one to reach one's spiritual goal. And karma yoga is the yoga of selfless action. What does this mean? Well, Krishna is suggesting that there's no way to avoid acting in the world. That in a way what Arjuna is doing is hesitating to be involved in the world at all. But Krishna claims this isn't really the right approach. The right approach is to go ahead and do what you are required to do, but do it in a spirit of self-surrender, without any sense that you're going to get any good outcome for yourself from it. Krishna says, for example, always perform with detachment any action you must do. Performing action with detachment, one achieves the supreme good. So the idea is, go ahead and continue about your business. Whatever you're obligated to do because of the job you have, go ahead and do it. But instead of viewing this as a means to getting whatever you want, to get some kind of reward, to see good consequences coming from it, just accept this as your obligation and turn it over, in a sense, to Brahman within. Krishna also encourages, besides karma yoga, what can be called bhakti yoga, or a spirit of bhakti, which means devotion. Krishna points out that he is, in fact, Vishnu, and that the appropriate attitude to have, besides self-surrender, is to devote all of this to him as the supreme being. This is actually the same as the being that's within all of us. So to be single-minded in one's purpose, to be devoted to Brahman, or Brahman as personified in Vishnu, and also to go about one's everyday actions, but with a spirit of detachment, without really caring too much about what the outcome is the correct way to proceed. In talking about bhakti yoga, Krishna says, keep your mind on me. Be my devotee, sacrificing, bow to me. You will come to me, I promise, for you are dear to me. Relinquishing all sacred duties to me, make me your only refuge. Do not grieve, for I shall free you from all evils. Now, obviously, he realizes that Arjuna is looking at all of his neighbors and kinsmen and countrymen and thinking, this is terrible. A lot of them are going to die as a consequence of my giving this order. And that's one of the reasons that he hesitates. But Krishna points out to him that he's really understanding death in the wrong way. What he's concerned with is the status of these individuated beings that he thinks he sees in front of him. But that's a superficial way of looking at it. Their true selves aren't these individuated roles that they've taken on in this kind of mortal form. Basically, individuated selves are the wrong way to understand either ourself or anyone else. And so, unfortunately, what Arjuna is doing is paying a lot of attention to these individuated persons, this particular role in the performance of Brahman generally, and viewing that as what's important, and then grieving because these particular roles come to an end. But Krishna points out, well, that's really inappropriate. Pitying these individuated selves isn't understanding the true story. Basically, we all end up taking on a life and dying, but as he puts it, it's like changing clothes. The individuated self is something that's merely superficial, and what's important continues. So he's made a mistake in assessing the situation. It's not as if anything true about these beings that he sees around him is really going to die. Instead, it's just this temporary mask that is an individual life. Now, two important concepts emerge in Krishna's discussion that I'd like to say a bit about. One of these is a notion we've already mentioned, and this is the notion of dharma. Dharma is the notion of law or rules, what's right practice. And as I've mentioned, this is understood in terms of the position that one has. So there's the right practice for someone who is a parent. There's the right practice for someone who is a farmer. And it's important to do your obligation, to fulfill your obligation, that you do what's right given that role. So one of the things that Krishna points out to Arjuna is that he, after all, is a warrior. He's, in fact, at this point in the story, already well known as a famous archer. And the fact that he's a warrior makes a big difference here. Someone who's a general shouldn't be spending his time reflecting on the correctness of war, certainly not at the beginning of a battle. His role is to play his part in that. And so his dharma is to continue to function as a warrior. Maybe in his spare time later on, if he survives, he can reflect about the nature of war. But this is completely out of keeping with what his obligation is in the here and now. He emphasizes this very emphatically, saying, better one's own right way, where way here is dharma, though flawed, than the way of another perfectly followed. Death following one's own way is better. The way of another is perilous. So the idea is that you may see other people who have different roles behaving differently, and maybe that's appropriate for them. But just because you see other ways of being in the world doesn't mean you should take those roles on yourself. You have one in a society that is being discussed here. The role is assigned by birth. Basically, you're born into a family that has a certain hereditary occupation. So it's not appropriate to go around looking at other things that other people do and figuring out whether you think those would be nicer values to have or not. Your role is a specific one. Society depends on it. In fact, Krishna says, well, look, suppose I stopped acting. You know, I'm Vishnu. If I stopped acting, the whole world would come to an end. And besides that, and here's where Sankhya comes in a little bit, the gunas would make you act anyway. The gunas, again, are these aspects of the manifestation of nature. And everything around us is some combination of the light guna, the active guna, and the inert guna. And the fact that there are all these pressures going on in nature, all of these are impinging on us in certain kinds of ways until we become completely psychologically free. So the idea that he could just not act is not really an option. What he can do is not fulfill his obligation, but that's certainly not going to improve his situation. Now, one part of the notion of karma is that any action bears fruit. No matter what we do, there are going to be some consequences of it. And karma the whole notion of karma includes notions of dispositions to act in certain ways. The word, in fact, comes from a root meaning to do or to act. And so if the idea of karma is that action bears fruit, we could talk a bit about what those fruits are. One of the main fruits of acting a certain way is the tendency to continue to act in a certain way. We develop certain psychological dispositions. Patanjali talks about this in the Yoga Sutras. As he puts it, a man's latent tendencies have been created by past thoughts and actions. These tendencies will bear fruits both in this life and in lives to come. You might think about just how easy it is to develop habits. The habit of smoking, for example, is very hard to break. But there are also good habits, habits that stand us in good stead. Good study skills, as teachers in elementary school sometimes talk about, are habits too. You get into certain kinds of ways of behaving, and they become simply customary. Now, these habits are matters of patterns of the way the mind learns to respond to certain kinds of things. And so it's not just the immediate result that you see of one particular action that is the fruit of your action, but instead, acting a certain way enables you to develop certain kinds of habits. And these unfold over time. The habit of good study skills, if that's what you've developed, will show up later on when you have occasion to use them, even if there's not a kind of immediate connection between the initial learning the study skills and this particular occasion. There's a certain amount of time lag in the way karma exhibits itself. So it does unfold over time, and sometimes unfolds in ways that strike us as rather surprising. Unfortunately, not all habits are good habits. In fact, many are fairly bad habits. And klesas, hindrances, a word we've encountered before, come about because of bad karma. Certain habits that are really basically bad, maladjusted habits, but habits that we've learned nevertheless. I think a kind of way of getting a sense of how these habits build up is suggested by Christopher Isherwood, who comments on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. He describes them as such. One may develop the analogy of a lake. Waves do not merely disturb the surface of the water, they also, by their continued action, build up banks of sand or pebbles on the lake bottom. Such sandbanks are, of course, much more permanent and solid than the waves themselves. They may be compared to the tendencies, potentialities, and latent states which exist in the subconscious and unconscious areas of the mind. The samskaras are built up by the continued action of the thought waves, and they in turn create new thought waves. The process works both ways. Samskaras, I should just mention, are the residues, these residues in the unconscious that come from acting in certain ways. So to continue, expose the mind to constant thoughts of anger and resentment, And you will find that these anger waves build up anger samskaras, which will predispose you to find occasions for anger throughout your daily life. The sum total of our samskaras is, in fact, our character at any given moment. Okay, now that last proviso, at any given moment, is important because there's a flow of all of this. It's not simply that you act a certain way and you build up these really firm banks of pebbles or sand in the metaphor. Instead, it's possible to work against certain things that have been built up. You can act in a way that tends to operate against certain habits that you formed. It can be rather difficult to change a habit. Certainly, smokers recognize that, smokers who try to quit at any rate. But nevertheless, it is possible to change these things. It's not absolutely set in stone. So it's not a completely fatalistic kind of notion. It's not as if, oh no, I did something in the past and that's going to continue to be with me all my life. Of course, in one sense, it is going to continue with you, but so are all your other actions. Now, an important thing to notice about karma, well, actually two things are important to notice. One is it can be a matter of group karma. Groups, not just individuals, can have karma. So you can say a whole society has built up certain kinds of habits. You might think of the way people do business or the way people interact with each other in a society. If you travel around, you notice that people have different styles. Well, in a sense, that's kind of group karma exhibiting itself. And there can be retribution as a result of it. You might say that karma is a notion of justice, but very retributive in the sense that whatever it is that you do ends up having repercussions, whatever you think about it. Second point that I want to make about karma, which is really quite interesting, is that it's actions, not intentions, that really count. Now, I think that maybe seems strange to us in the West, particularly since Kant. In a way, it's almost the opposite of Kant's ethical theory. Kant's claim is nothing is completely good except a good will. And what really counts when we're talking about somebody being moral or immoral is what they're intending to do. People can intend the right thing, and that's really what you can judge them on morally, even if for some reason what they intended to do doesn't quite work out. This is really just the opposite view, at least as initially stated. The opposite view because it's your action that really determines what sort of waves you're building up, or what sort of banks, in a sense, you're building up. We might compare this to Oedipus Rex, Sophocles' play, where Oedipus certainly doesn't intend to kill his father, and he certainly doesn't intend to marry his mother. It's just that is, in fact, what the actions are. But at the end of that play, he feels really guilty. And again, I think from the perspective of a world where we're accustomed to Kant's way of thinking, it seems sort of strange. I mean, like, well, he didn't really know what he was doing. Can you really hold him responsible? Well, in a sense, the notion of karma is that, yes, you should hold him responsible because he has acted against dharma. If you think of dharma as being about certain kinds of rules, you could violate rules in lots of different spirits. Now, this raises the question, how then can it be that Krishna is saying karma yoga is the way to behave? Because after all, isn't any kind of action just going to continue to build up karma? Well, actually, no. The idea of performing every action in a spirit of detachment with your heart fixed on Vishnu, or on Krishna, manifestation of Vishnu, is that it's not really, in some sense, you acting. It's not your personality sort of getting more and more stuck in certain kinds of habits and behaviors. Instead, you've resigned that. You've sort of pulled your personality out of it, and you're just going through the action that's required of you. Now, karma is something, as I mentioned, that is in flux. Your personality at any given moment is the sum total of all these habits that you formed, but these things can change. And so one of the ways of neutralizing bad karma is to start acting in a virtuous way. You can build good habits too. At first it's difficult, but as they become more habitual, it becomes easier. And that's one of the ways. But Krishna's recommendation is that it's not just the fact that these are virtuous actions, but also that your personality isn't getting further molded by performing anything in particular. You've, in a sense, moved your personality out, your the notion of yourself as an individual out of the picture, and simply view yourself as a kind of conduit for certain processes in the world. as he puts it, or Krishna puts it. One whose instigations and undertakings are all free from the motive of personal desire, the wise see that person as truly learned, him whose karma has been burned up in the fire of knowledge. Having abandoned attachment to the fruits of work, constantly satisfied, independent, one does nothing whatsoever, even while thoroughly engaged in work. Now, it's strange, again, to think of doing nothing whatsoever, even though you're just going about your ordinary business. But nevertheless, Krishna claims that there is a sense in which you're doing nothing whatsoever, where doing here is basically the same word as karma. You're not building up new karma. You're not building up your personality. You just submitted yourself to the will of God, in effect. And so your behavior is just fulfilling that. You're certainly not concerned with reward. One of the main themes in the Bhagavad Gita is that people who work for results may think that they're actually helping themselves to get satisfaction in life. But actually what they're doing when they really, really desire something is building up karma and making themselves miserable. I mean, you might think of really wanting something a lot. Suppose it's a new car, say a Boxster. And you might really enjoy thinking about getting the Boxster, what you're going to do when you have it, where you'll drive, and so on. But at the same time, you're building up all of these kind of insistences within yourself that really want the world to cooperate with what your plan is. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. If it does, and you get the Boxster, are you happy? Well, not automatically. Actually, I mean, literature is full of people that get a lot of things they want and they're still not happy. And this seems perfectly appropriate given the picture in the Bhagavad Gita. The notion of just getting certain things, even though that might be what a lot of us think is the name of the game, is not helpful to us at all in a kind of fundamental spiritual sense. What we tend to do is want more things just because we've gotten in the habit of thinking wanting things gets us what we want. Well, let's try that again. So the goal actually wasn't so important in the first place. Let's suppose you don't get what you want. Well, then you're really frustrated. This whole aim to get a certain kind of thing, and that's going to be what makes you happy or not. It certainly might not make you happy if you get it, but it's probably going to make you fairly unhappy if you don't. So that's a route to misery. Just the whole process of looking to something in the external world that has to cooperate with you in order to be happy is a trap. And that's one of the things that Krishna is pointing out to Arjuna. Now, it may seem like sort of a different goal that Arjuna has when he pauses before the battle. He's looking around, seeing all these people, realizing that he's going to be involved in some sense in the killing of some of them. And you have to say, well, this is kind of a sensitive reaction. It doesn't seem quite the same thing as I want a new car no matter what. But nevertheless, Krishna is saying he's still paying much too much attention to what the results of his action are going to be. Those things are not entirely in his control anyway. But even if they were, the idea of I act to get something is really misunderstanding your place in the world. Again, it's giving too much importance to your individual sense of self. The illusion is that we're the individual selves that we think we are. And so anytime we tend to get caught up in what the results of our actions are going to be, we're just reinforcing that illusion. The habit we're really building up is the habit of thinking of ourselves as absolutely some particular person with a certain goal, certain things that will improve the lifestyle of, and so on. Thinking about improving our lifestyle is not having the right kind of orientation toward life. Instead, what we need to do is recognize that our own will is only a kind of superficial manifestation of something much more fundamental. You might think of this as, in a way, fighting against the flow of things, too. I mean, this is to make it sound a little bit like some themes we'll talk about later on in Chinese thought. But there's a sense in which, if all of us really are manifestations of Brahman, the one true reality, then all the kind of superficial antagonisms that we have, problems that we have with each other, are extremely superficial, and in fact the wrong thing to be noticing entirely. Of course, Arjuna is right in one sense when he notices gee, I'm related to all these people. Indeed, he is. In fact, if you look deep enough, the relationship he has is a relationship of identity. They're all manifestations of Brahman. He just like all the rest of them. But the mistake is thinking that what he ought to do is, in some sense, save his own skin or save his own sense of whether or not he's a good person by not being involved in a world of activity. And that's something Krishna claims he simply can't do. He's not only obligated morally to act in a certain way, to play out the role of being the warrior, but taking this individual role seriously, he has to play the individual role out. The trick is really to see this role that he has to play out. I mean, as an individual, he should carry on with the mask, this particular mask that Brahman has taken on. There is a storyline that he's part of, and he can't just sort of say, I wish it were otherwise, and get that to change. So insofar as we're talking about the world where there are individual agents, people acting, he's one of them and he has a role to play. But in the deeper sense, he himself is the same self as all the others. All are Atman, and Atman ultimately is Brahman. So to take on the role that one has been assigned in society is really to have a certain respect for this process that Brahman is involved in. If you view the world as Brahman in its effect putting on a play, and each of us is being actors in that play, it's not a very respectful attitude toward fundamental reality to say, well, I don't like the play, or, wrong role for me, why don't you get a substitute? There is no substitute in the first place, but it's just the wrong attitude. The correct attitude is just self-surrender, surrendering yourself to the role, really taking it on. You might compare this actually to a real play. Suppose you've been assigned a part and you really don't even like the character that you're playing. Well, that's not going to be a very helpful thing to keep in mind. You're probably not going to be a very good actor insofar as you're doing that. But nevertheless, if you're in that role, it's probably going to be best to find something about it that you do like. But most important, take on that personality entirely. Stop thinking about the fact that, well, I have one personality, my role has another, and I really don't know how I'm going to manage to put this one on. It's just not me. Forget you. In effect, that's what Krishna is saying. Forget you in the sense that you're thinking about it. If you're talking about you as an individual, that's not the important thing. What's important is really to play out your role in the play and to view that as your religious vocation. Now here we've got a big distinction between the Bhagavad Gita's vision of ethics and what one sometimes gets from certain Indian schools of thought. Particularly if a lot of focus is placed on the idea of becoming a renouncer late in life. It might seem that the picture of karma yoga is really still involving you way too much in the activity of the world. What Krishna is saying is you don't have to leave the world of everyday life in order to be an ethically good person. In fact, your ethical obligation is to play out a role in this world. So how do you do that correctly? Spiritually? Perform everything you do in a spiritual light. Think of all of this as your participation in Brahman's activity in the world. It can be absolutely anything. Setting a table, washing the dishes, all these have a new spiritual significance if you see these all as part of your way of playing out this whole play that Brahman is manifesting in the world. If you start to see all the other people you interact with, you've got your role, they've got theirs. All these interactions are opportunities to see Atman, God, all around you and within yourself. And that's really the best way to look at your activities in the world. The Bhagavad Gita then does bring a kind of synthesis to certain streams of thought in Indian philosophy that don't initially look very compatible. It certainly acknowledges that all of these various paths that people have argued, Sankhya school, various forms of Brahmanism, all are seeking the same thing, a way of realizing that we each are manifestations of the same God. Sankhya maybe doesn't talk in those terms, but that's how the Bhagavad Gita would look at it. It has its own way of approaching the purification that's necessary, and that's all good. In fact, even some of the analysis is very helpful. But at the same time, the Vedas' idea that there's a single reality is something really important, and that puts all these everyday activities into place. So finally, if we just look at our individual life as a kind of particle of Brahman in the world, amidst all kinds of other particles of Brahman, we can see that the Bhagavad Gita gives us this vision of life just in the everyday world as an absolutely beautiful spiritual thing. Ultimately, there's only supreme consciousness. It is real. Everything else, our sense of our possession of our activities, is merely superficial.